It's Dr. Steve Kahn. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more of this important content. So this is high yield content here for the endocrine system. We're looking at a very important gland here today, which is the pituitary gland, sometimes called the adenohypophysis or the neurohypophysis. And this gland here is this little tiny structure, a little larger than a pea, that sits at the base of the brain, and it sits literally in the horse's saddle called the sella turcica of your sphenoid bone. So if you guys remember your bones, sphenoid bone, sella turcica, the pituitary gland is going to sit right in that little seat there. And the significance here of this neuroendocrine structure is that it's going to secrete 8 hormones, 6 of them from the anterior pituitary and 2 from the posterior. So the anterior pituitary is really interesting because it is derived from oral mucosa during embryonic development, and it is glandular in nature, and because of that, it's called the adenohypophysis. It makes up 75% of this gland. The remaining 25% is also called the neurohypophysis because the embryonic development comes from its neural downgrowth, so it has neural tissue in its makeup, versus the anterior, which is glandular in its makeup. So you have 2 glands in one. Again, this is called the pituitary gland, and sometimes if you look at just the anterior, it's called the adenohypophysis. And if you look at the posterior, it's called the neurohypophysis. So very interesting to keep that in mind. So what hormones are produced here? We're gonna take a look at the anterior first, and then we're gonna look at posterior. The one to keep in mind here in the anterior is a hormone called TSH, okay? Thyroid stimulating hormone. So anytime that you think about pituitary gland, you have to go one level up. What is the association with pituitary? One level up, it's going to be the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, remember, has many nuclei, dozens and dozens of nuclei that have very specific functions. What are the main functions here? There's a relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So you're gonna have hormones that stimulate the pituitary gland. You're gonna have hormones that inhibit the pituitary gland. So the hormone that's going to stimulate the pituitary gland here to secrete thyroid stimulating hormone is a hormone called thyroid releasing hormone. So if we just think about the letters, R comes before S. So thyroid releasing comes from where? The level above, hypothalamus. Thyroid stimulating, S, comes from the pituitary. Which side of the pituitary? Anterior. Now, what is the end effect here of the anterior pituitary gland? Well, because it secretes thyroid stimulating hormone, the target cell is going to be which structure? The thyroid gland. So if we look at the thyroid gland, we're going to notice that the thyroid gland here is this butterfly-shaped structure that is going to be inferior to the larynx, inferior to the thyroid cartilage. And this structure here, this gland, has a very important function. It is the body's major metabolic gland because it secretes T3 and T4. Those 2 hormones are the body's major metabolic hormones. What does that mean? Metabolism, right? Building up, breaking down, catabolic reactions, anabolic reactions in all our cells. Who's in charge of that? The thyroid gland via T3 and T4. Now, T3 is sometimes called triiodothyronin, and T4 is called thyroxine. So again, both hormones, they are the skeleton key to all of the receptors in the body, all of the cell receptors, and they're going to unlock all those cell doors, and they're going to allow for metabolism to take effect. So very important to understand that cascade of where does it start? In the hypothalamus, through what structure, what hormone? Thyroid, remember the alphabet, thyroid releasing hormone, TRH. That's going to stimulate the pituitary gland to release thyroid stimulating hormone. That thyroid stimulating hormone is going to have its effect where? On the thyroid gland. That thyroid gland is then going to secrete T3 and T4, which are your thyroid hormones. And those hormones have their effect where? All over the body, right? What's the effect? Metabolism. It's going to basically be it's going to increase my basal metabolic rate, my BMR. That's the significance of that hormone. Very important to understand that cascade, okay? That's one. Let's take a look at another hormone called ACTH. ACTH stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. So this is another hormone that's going to be produced by the anterior pituitary gland, right? But what stimulates that hormone to be produced? We got to go back one. Let's go back to the hypothalamus. In the hypothalamus, I'm going to secrete something called CRH. CRH. We have corticotropin releasing hormone. So corticotropin releasing hormone in the hypothalamus stimulates ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, in the anterior pituitary to be released. Now we have to ask ourselves, what's the effect? Where is the target cell? The target cell of that particular hormone is going to be where? If you follow this structure here, it's going to be the cortex of the adrenal gland. The cortex of the adrenal gland here, the outer layer, it's going to stimulate cortisol secretion, adrenocorticotropic hormone. It's going to stimulate cortisol to be produced, to be released from the adrenal gland. What does cortisol do? Remember, it's my hormone that deals with biological stressors. Anytime that we're under stress, cortisol gets released. And also don't forget the very important function that cortisol also has, which is to regulate my blood glucose level so I have a constant blood glucose level throughout the day. I don't have spikes and drops. Spikes and drops are no good. We want a steady state. Who's in charge of that? Cortisol. How does cortisol get produced? In order to regulate my blood glucose levels? Through ACTH. Who produces ACTH? The pituitary gland. What stimulates the pituitary gland to produce ACTH? The hypothalamus via CRH. All right, that's another very important hormone to keep in mind. Let's take a look at another one. We've got follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, and luteinizing hormone. So both of these hormones are going to be stimulated by something called gonadotropin releasing hormone in the hypothalamus. So in the hypothalamus, we have a hormone called gonadotropin, or GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. That's going to stimulate, once again, my anterior pituitary to produce two hormones that are very close friends. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. And both of these hormones have their effect where? On the gonads, okay? So we got testes, we got ovaries, we got the endometrium. These are hormones that deal with reproduction, reproductive capabilities, reproductive functions. So those two are together. Target cells, the gonads, ovaries, testes, and the endometrium. The next one up is prolactin. Prolactin, sometimes abbreviated as PRL. That hormone is one of the very few hormones that deals with positive feedback mechanisms. Just about every single other hormone that you can tell or deal with. So if we look at our 8 hormones that we talked about earlier, 6 of the 8 are all under negative feedback mechanisms. There's only 2 that deal with positive feedback mechanisms. And remember, negative feedback mechanisms means that I'm trying to return back to my state of balance, of normalcy. If my body temperature is 98.6, and if I get too cold, my body's gonna wanna warm up. If my body temperature gets too high, it's gonna wanna cool down to bring me back to my normal 98.6. The body's all about homeostasis. So that's called negative feedback. If I go above and beyond the norm, that's called positive feedback. So there's only 2 hormones here that produce positive feedback mechanisms or systems. One of them is prolactin. And prolactin is going to stimulate the lactotrophs in breast tissue. Lacto meaning milk. Lactotrophs, lactic cells, to basically start producing milk. And this happens only when an individual is pregnant, delivering, right? We're talking about the gestational phase of pregnancy, and shortly thereafter, we're going to see the stimulation of this hormone on the lactotrophs within breast tissue to allow for that person to basically lactate. So again, that's a positive feedback because normally the individual is not lactating. It's only when prolactin is stimulating those lactotrophs in breast tissue do you have lactation, and that only happens when you have gestation, pregnancy. Those are the major hormones. Those are the 6 major hormones that we just talked about in the anterior pituitary. There's 2 more in the posterior pituitary. The last 2 to kind of keep in mind and note here on the posterior side are are going to be ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. So if we go back to our model here, we've been talking about the anterior pituitary. 75%, remember 75% of my size, the mass, is all anterior because it's producing 6 hormones. Only 25% of the mass is dedicated to the posterior because there's only 2 hormones that are produced here. One of them is ADH. ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone. So antidiuretic hormone is going to be produced and is going to have its effect where? In the kidneys. So what happens with ADH? ADH means antidiuresis, anti-diuretic, anti-urination. So the person's going to basically retain water at the level of the kidneys. They're not going to urinate. So if antidiuretic hormone is produced by the posterior pituitary, the target cell is going to be the kidneys. And the kidneys are going to basically want to retain more water. If I retain more water, my blood volume goes up and my blood pressure goes up. We're going to see this hormone activated in people that are maybe dehydrated. Maybe they've been vomiting all day, they've had diarrhea. Someone that's been, let's say, exercising and sweating and not drinking fluids, right? Those types of individuals might be hypotensive. So the body's going to want to retain as much water as possible and not want to lose any water. So what hormone is called into play? Posterior pituitary. We've got ADH. ADH has its effect where? On the kidneys. I'm retaining more water. My blood volume's going up. My blood pressure's going up. This is a positive effect that we're going to have with respect to blood pressure because I want to get it back to the normal level. I don't want to be hypotensive. Back to normal. The other hormone to keep in mind here is oxytocin. So oxytocin is another very important hormone that's a positive feedback mechanism hormone. Earlier we talked about 2 hormones that are going to have a positive effect, positive feedback mechanism. One is prolactin, milk. The other is oxytocin. That's going to deal with uterine contractions. So again, during childbirth, at the end of 36 weeks, we need to expel the fetus, and the uterus is going to start to contract more so than ever. You're going to have very strong, powerful uterine contractions. So again, muscle tone goes way above normal, way above the normal tone. What hormone is in charge of that? Oxytocin. So oxytocin produced by the posterior pituitary and basically stimulating the uterine muscle, the myometrium, to contract to expel the neonate, the fetus to be a neonate. And I am simplifying when I say produce because in reality, both ADH and oxytocin are actually synthesized in the hypothalamus, and they're going to be stored in the posterior pituitary. So you might want to watch out with that little fun fact there. It's like when you talk about synthesis, the actual synthesis of ADH and oxytocin is actually in the hypothalamus, and through nervous tracts, they're going to be deposited and kept or stored in the posterior pituitary. But in reality, they're actually synthesized in the hypothalamus and then stored in the posterior pituitary gland, okay, or the neural hypophysis. And those are all 8 hormones that we just reviewed. Thanks so much for joining. See you in the next one.